Ron Howard has always been the calm center in the middle of chaos, a director who believes in dignity, restraint, and simple human kindness. But when he was asked about the darker side of the business that raised him, his expression changed real quick. "You wouldn't believe what those legends did when the camera stopped rolling," he once said quietly. And yeah, to him, the golden age of Hollywood wasn't golden at all. It was a world built on silence, cruelty, and straight-up exploitation. A world where fame excused everything. The same actors who shaped America's dreams also wrecked countless lives behind closed doors. And now, decades later, Ron Howard is willing to say their names. Errol Flynn, the devil hiding behind that charming smile. Before there was James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling hero who embodied charm, danger, and reckless desire. On screen, he looked like the perfect adventurer. Off-screen, though, he was something way closer to a predator. Born in 1909 in Tasmania, Flynn rolled into Hollywood during the 1930s and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood, 1935. The studios built a whole empire around his charisma, but beneath all that polish was a man drowning in arrogance and addiction. By 1942, his reputation turned toxic. Two teenage girls, Peggy Satterley and Betty Hansen, accused Flynn of statutory rape. The trial, blasted across every newspaper, split America right down the middle. Flynn laughed through testimony like the whole thing was a joke, mocking the charges as if his stardom made him untouchable, like he was some kind of king. Warner Brothers brought in elite lawyers. Fans camped outside the courthouse like it was a damn concert. And studio executives secretly paid witnesses to disappear. He was acquitted, but his behavior only got worse. In private letters later revealed in 1978, Flynn bragged about his conquests and mocked the women who feared him. Ron Howard once described reading about that trial as a turning point, saying it was the moment when I realized Hollywood could protect monsters if they smiled for the camera. To the public, Flynn stayed the charming rogue. But to insiders, he was a walking warning sign. Alcohol, cocaine, and financial ruin slowly swallowed him. By 1959, at just 50, his body finally collapsed in Vancouver after years of abuse. His autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers. But for Howard, the real cause was simpler. He died the same way he lived, taking everything and giving nothing. Flynn's story became the blueprint for Hollywood's moral decay. A brutal reminder that charm can hide cruelty, and that fame, in the end, forgives no one. Kirk Douglas, the man who just couldn't stop fighting. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas represented the perfect contradiction of Hollywood's golden era. A man who spoke about honor and justice on screen while spreading fear and humiliation off it. Born Iser Daniel Danlovic in 1916 to poor immigrant parents, Douglas clawed his way out of poverty with pure willpower and stubborn drive. By the time Spartacus turned him into a global icon, he had everything. Fame, money, respect. The whole package. But the people who worked with him remembered something darker, a violent temper that never shut off when the cameras stopped rolling. Crew members described Douglas as impossible to please, the kind of guy who could explode in anger out of nowhere and leave people shaken or in tears. Actress Deborah Padet once said he didn't just want to dominate a scene. He wanted to dominate everyone in it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's performances as a young filmmaker, later admitted, "There's a kind of rage under that smile, the kind that eats a person alive." And yeah, that rage followed Douglas for the rest of his career. Whispers about his behavior toward women have haunted Hollywood for decades. Biographers and insiders have pointed to his involvement in the 1950s rape of rising actress Natalie Wood when she was just 16. The claim surfaced after Wood's death and was repeated by her sister Lana in her 2018 memoir. Douglas never faced charges, and the story got buried under the same machinery of silence that protected so many powerful men of that era. Even after his death in 2020 at the age of 103, the controversy came roaring back, not as gossip, but as a reckoning. On film sets, his presence could inspire people and scare the hell out of them at the same time. Stanley Kubrick, who directed him twice, called him the most driven man I've ever met and the hardest to control. Ron Howard once reflected that the real lesson from Douglas's career wasn't about talent or fame, it was about power. He believed the rules didn't apply to him, and Hollywood basically nodded and agreed. When Douglas accepted an honorary Oscar in 1996, many people saw an old man searching for peace. But for Howard, it looked like something else entirely. The final act of a performer who had spent his entire life running from his own demons. Beneath all the applause sat a truth Hollywood never wanted to face, that some of its greatest legends built their legacy not on brilliance, but on fear. Faye Dunaway, the queen of cruelty. If Errol Flynn represented corruption and Kirk Douglas symbolized unchecked rage, then Faye Dunaway stood for something colder. Cruelty wrapped in beauty. To Ron Howard, she proved that evil in Hollywood didn't always show up as violence. Sometimes it appeared through control, humiliation, and an ego so massive it crushed everyone nearby. Born in 1941 in Bockham, Florida, Dunaway's rise was meteoric. From Bonnie and Clyde, 1967, to Chinatown, 1974, she looked completely untouchable, a goddess of cinema, icy and magnetic. But behind that brilliance, stories about her cruelty spread quietly through the industry. Crew members talked about her tantrums, her endless demands, and the way she treated assistants like they were disposable. Her mommy, Dearest co-star Rutana Aldo once said, "You could feel the fear on set. Everyone was just waiting for her to explode." That film, meant to be a dark portrait of abuse, ended up reflecting Dunaway herself in a strange way. Ironically, while playing Joan Crawford, a woman famous for cruelty, Dunaway reportedly mirrored the same behavior. Director Frank Perry later admitted he even thought about quitting because of her wild outbursts. She threw objects, screamed at makeup artists, and once refused to film until the lighting made her look divine. Ron Howard later pointed to her as a perfect example of what happens when an actor's hunger for control turns into emotional terrorism. And the stories didn't end there. During The Wicked Lady, Dunaway allegedly slapped a cameraman and spat on a crew member. On Don Juan DeMarco, she was said to have humiliated assistants so badly that production stopped for an entire day. Her former manager Jay Bernstein once said, "Faye doesn't just play divas, she becomes them." By the 2000s, her reputation finally caught up with her. Hollywood basically stopped calling. Directors refused to work with her, saying she was impossible to manage. In 2011, after being fired from a Broadway revival of Tea at 5, Dunaway blamed everyone except herself. When a journalist later asked Ron Howard about her legacy, his answer was polite but sharp. She chased perfection so hard she forgot compassion. Dunaway's fall wasn't sudden. It was slow and painful. The woman who once conquered Hollywood eventually ended up isolated, avoided even at retrospectives of her own films. For Howard, she became the symbol of cruelty's price, a warning that talent without empathy eventually destroys itself. People talk about power, he once said, but in Hollywood, power without grace turns into poison. John Wayne, the tyrant of the West. Few figures ever towered over Hollywood like John Wayne. To millions of fans, he represented the very image of America itself. The fearless cowboy, the soldier, the tough guy every man wanted to be. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching him on black and white television, the truth behind that rugged image was a lot darker. When I finally learned what he was really like, Howard once reflected, "Man, I stopped seeing the hero. I started seeing the bully who wore his country like a damn costume." Born Marion Morrison in 1907 in Iowa, Wayne climbed through the studio system by projecting this myth of unshakable masculinity. By the 1950s, he wasn't just some actor anymore. Nah, he had become an ideology. The guy saw dissent as weakness and progress as betrayal. On film sets, he ruled with straight-up intimidation. Technicians who failed to meet his expectations got cursed out in front of everybody. Fellow actor Christopher Mitchum once said, "When Duke was angry, the air froze. You either rolled with him or you were out. Simple as that." Howard later called that kind of atmosphere the exact opposite of art. It was fear pretending to be discipline. Wayne's cruelty didn't stop at the workplace either. He was known for belittling women in public, mocking indigenous actors on Western sets, and brushing off black performers who challenged stereotypes. His 1971 Playboy interview still stands as one of the most disturbing documents of Hollywood's golden age. In that conversation, he straight up declared that Native Americans were selfishly keeping land, that black people were not yet responsible enough for self-governance, and that films needed men, not whiners. Those statements sparked outrage decades later when they resurfaced, revealing not a patriot, but a man trapped in hate. On the set of The Searchers, Wayne clashed bitterly with director John Ford over his insistence on portraying Ethan Edwards, a racist, vengeful Confederate, as sympathetic. For pushback, Wayne refused. In the final cut, the character's cruelty bled through, but so did the actor's contempt. Ron Howard, who later studied that performance at USC, said, "It's terrifying because you can't tell where the role ends and the man begins." Even in his final years, weakened by cancer, Wayne never apologized. He dismissed critics as soft and blamed the changing culture for his isolation. He died in 1979 at 72, still hailed by many as an American icon. But to filmmakers like Ron Howard, his story became a cautionary tale. Proof that power built on prejudice doesn't age into wisdom, it just curdles into bitterness. The myth survived, Howard once said, but the man behind it never deserved the legend. Roman Polanski, the exile of shame. For Ron Howard, the name Roman Polanski represented the one truth Hollywood never wanted to face. That brilliance can exist right next to evil. I admired his films before I knew who he really was, Howard once admitted. Then I realized talent doesn't absolve a person. Sometimes it hides them. Polanski's rise was meteoric. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents and a survivor of Nazi occupation, he seemed destined for tragedy long before fame. His breakout films, Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby, made him a genius in the eyes of critics, a visionary who turned paranoia into poetry. But the darkness haunting his movies wasn't just fiction. It was a reflection of himself. In March 1977, the illusion shattered. Polanski was arrested for the sexual assault of 13-year-old Samantha Gay after a photo shoot at Jack Nicholson's Los Angeles home. The evidence was overwhelming. Polanski pleaded guilty to unlawful sex with a minor. Before sentencing, he fled the United States, escaping to France, and never came back. Hollywood split in two. Some people condemned him, others defended him like he was some tortured artist. For Howard, then a young filmmaker, the reaction was devastating. They spoke about art while a child's life was broken, he said years later. Polanski's exile became one of Hollywood's ugliest moral stains. He kept directing abroad, even winning an Oscar in 2003 for The Pianist, a moment Howard described as surreal and sickening. As the audience inside the Dolby Theater stood up clapping, Howard refused to stand. I thought about that girl alone at 13 and how applause must sound to her ears. Even decades later, the industry's willingness to separate genius from guilt still infuriated him. When Polanski won France's César Award in 2020, protesters stormed out. For Howard, that moment symbolized justice arriving late, but not too late. It took the world 40 years to say what should have been said the next day. That a monster doesn't become less monstrous just because he can frame a shot, he told Vanity Fair in 2021. Polanski remains free in Europe, untouchable but haunted, his name now synonymous with hypocrisy. For Howard, his story represents everything that poisoned the Golden Age, a system that protects the artist and abandons the victim. Hollywood forgives anything, he once said bitterly, as long as the lighting is good. Mickey Rooney, the smile that lied. If Roman Polanski symbolized Hollywood's hypocrisy, Mickey Rooney represented its illusion, the idea that charm could wipe away cruelty. For Ron Howard, who grew up watching Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, discovering who he really was hit hard. He was the face of joy, Howard once said. But behind that smile was misery. And worse, he spread it. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Mickey Rooney became Hollywood's first true child superstar. By the time he was 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America. MGM built an empire around his grin, the all-American kid singing and dancing his way into everyone's hearts. But fame on that level messed him up early. He married 8 times, cheated constantly, gambled away millions, and humiliated the people who loved him. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once called him the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, things got even darker. In 2011, his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and his stepson were accused of elder abuse and financial manipulation, draining Rooney's accounts while cutting him off from family. But long before that, the damage Rooney caused others was already well known. Former co-stars described him as volatile and cruel. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately, "He could make you laugh one moment and destroy you the next." Garland, pushed hard by studio bosses and emotionally shattered, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, carried some blame for her suffering. By the 1960s, his career had completely collapsed. Addiction, bankruptcy, and scandal followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, Rooney claimed, "I've lived 1,000 lives." But as Ron Howard later reflected, he lived every single one of them for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's bitterness never faded. He blamed everyone, studios, wives, even God, for his downfall. When he died in 2014 at 93, his estate was worth less than $20,000. His body, at first unclaimed, was eventually buried in Los Angeles after friends raised money for a modest funeral. For Howard, Rooney's story was the last piece of a bigger pattern. Proof that the golden age of smiles were just masks. He made the world laugh while he was dying inside, Howard said, and maybe that's the saddest evil of all, when pain turns into performance and nobody even notices. For Ron Howard, these stories were never about revenge. They were warnings. Hollywood's golden age wasn't made of gold at all. It was built on silence, exploitation, and broken lives hidden behind fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror movies. They're the ones the spotlight protects. Which of these 6 actors shocked you the most? The predator, the tyrant, or the smiling liar? Let me know in the comments.